Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Bruchhaus, and welcome back to the Class Play on the Sumer Sports Show. Last week, we went over what to expect at the Combine. So this week, we're going position group by position group, checking our predictions and highlighting who stood out. Today, I again have 9.99 elite relative athletic score contributors with me, Ben Brown and Seth. Ben is coming off the weekend at the Sloan Sports and Analytics Conference. Ben, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, guys. Yeah, like you said, I got to experience Sloan for the first time. I definitely enjoyed myself. Basically, I don't know if it quite lived up to the Tulane NFL contract negotiation weekend, but it was a very close second, basically. So I enjoy myself. I'm like fully. I know everyone else now has fully turned the page to draft. I know we've kind of been at it for the last couple of months, but it is exciting to kind of get the momentum and push towards the NFL draft because I feel like we've been building for it for quite some time.
Exciting, man. And I always love the props toward Tulane. So looking at Tage, you have a piece up on sumersports.com right now highlighting the changes in how teams invest in the draft. How's it going, man?
Good. Yeah, I wasn't quite contributing to the sports analytics space like Ben was last week at Sloan, probably. But I hope some people can get some stuff out of that article that I just put up. Talking about draft capital and how positional value has really changed over time in the draft.
Lovely, man. So if you follow us on Twitter, you were with us last week, and we had a ton of predictions about the Combine, and we like to think we did pretty good. So let's start off, guys, with tight ends. We talked a lot about tight ends last week. Obviously, we know from Taja's earlier piece that this is one of the most predictive position groups when you're looking at Combine metrics. We focused a lot on Brock Bowers last week. Unfortunately, he didn't really participate in anything except weight, which didn't really show us that much. And we've done some work here at Sumer Sports that shows that, weight, it grows as the tight ends go on. But Ben, particularly last episode, you focused in on Cade Stover as someone who may show some value at the Combine and may provide a team with value late in the draft. Tell us more about Cade Stover.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in a lot of ways, I was hoping he would maybe test a little bit better. Obviously, in some ways, he needs to, showcase what he's been doing off the field because maybe the interpretation of what he did at Ohio State really doesn't justify as high of a draft pick. So I do think in some ways, although he tested pretty well, I think it was like 8.37 RAS score, relative athletic score that Kent Platt puts out. I think that's a really valuable resource to kind of see where he compares historically to other tight ends. And kind of like you said, I think overall decent 40 time, really, really, really poor shuttle. I think that it was like, I don't want to guess on percentiles, but it was pretty low from a tight end perspective. And I think in a lot of ways, the explosiveness that I maybe projected wasn't really there. Had just an average, I would say, vertical jump, 34.5 inches. So I think in some ways you can use, combine metrics and testing and those sorts of things for a number of reasons. And in some ways, a prospect that you maybe were higher on before can in some ways maybe not live up to that. And I think moving away from that is very much what I need to do with Cade Stover in particular. So although it was okay, I'm not as convinced as I was kind of headed into the draft that he is going to be a relevant fantasy player at the tight end position coming up in his rookie season.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we saw kind of the full spectrum of tight end metrics looking at what we thought was a pretty talented class. A lot of people who may be, in a day 2, day 3 grade. Someone like Jaheim Bell was someone who I was keeping an eye on. He did pretty good, great explosion grades, great speed grades, but obviously he's a little smaller guy. And that was kind of the knock on him coming in. Someone like Jatavian Sanders, who was being looked at as like, a tight end 2 in this draft. Didn't do as well, put up a good 40-yard dash, but not something that I would say would pass Taja's smell test. You can check out kind of where he landed on that positive correlation and whether he was in the breakdown. 4.69, that's getting a little low in terms of percentile there of what we'd like to see. But Tage, you were texting me during the Combine that Ben Sinnott had become your guy. Tell us more about Ben Sinnott.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw his combine numbers, it was really something that caught my attention for sure. He had a 9.75 relative athletic score overall, and he kind of fits in this theme of tight ends that are getting smaller, both from like a height and weight perspective, but are still hyper athletic athletes, and it does seem like they are getting more athletic every year just because of that size change in kind of how they're approaching the position. And for him, he was someone that ran a 4.68 40-yard dash. So, you just have to be under that 4.7 cutoff to be a pretty productive receiving tight end in the league. And he hit that. But I mean, his vertical being, a 99th percentile vertical, his broad jump being a 97th percentile broad jump. Like those were things that made me really excited about him. And, I even remember him from Kansas State, and he can play both fullback and tight end. He's going to be a pretty versatile piece for whatever team ends up taking him, either late day 2, early day 3. So I think all of those things combined with him being 21 years old makes him a very exciting prospect in this year's draft.
Yeah, and I think you brought two great things up, Tage. Number one, that he does have that positional versatility, which is something that we saw from both of the Super Bowl teams, obviously the 49ers working with Kyle Juszczyk and George Kittle, guys that can really mix it up. And that's something we brought up about, tight end 1, Brock Bowers right now, like as something that's really valuable. The Chiefs obviously ran a ton of 13 personnel, really got in the mix with positional versatility. And another great thing you mentioned was he's only 21. We've seen work and research done on tight end aging curves, and I think he really has the time to build on his skill set, or rather his agility, speed, composite explosion, so forth and so on, to turn into that kind of next level guy. And I'll be interested to see where he gets drafted and to which team he gets drafted, because I think if he gets used correctly, we could really see him blow up. And speaking of guys getting used correctly and really blowing up, Tage came out with a big prediction last week that Xavier Worthy was going to be the highlight of the combine. So moving from tight ends to wide receivers, Tage, here's your victory lap on Xavier Worthy, man.
It was cool to see him actually be the fastest receiver at the combine, which is kind of what we were talking about last week. I had no idea he was going to end up breaking the record. Obviously came in pretty light, at 165 pounds, but was clearly just preparing for the 40 and knows what it means for his draft capital to hit a 4.21 there and ended up hitting it. But I think the difference between Xavier Worthy and some of the other players that have had really fast 40s in the past, like John Ross, is like, again, Worthy was productive all 3 years in college. He has gotten dinged a little bit for limited route tree and, some drop issues, but like I still see his speed translating well to the NFL. I think that, he, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but like he might become drafted further past his, expected draft position going into the combine because of his combine performance, but he was still a borderline first round pick pre-combine, and like the 40 is going to push him into the first round, but he's still overall a very good prospect.
Yeah, I agree. And that John Ross comp is going to come up, but the league's changed. We've seen guys like Tyreek Hill obviously light it up on a year-to-year basis. I think coaches are a lot more willing to build schemes around guys. And I know last week you picked DeAnthony Thomas in your favorite draftee in terms of running backs. I think Xavier Worthy kind of has that pedigree of a wide receiver and not really just a jet sweep guy, kind of like a DeAnthony Thomas or Dexter McCluster back in the day were. And I'm really interested to see if he sees that big boost that we've seen with John Ross and other wide receivers and may jump into, the top 15 or top 10, despite there being more research about, maybe if he does make that jump, it's not going to necessarily be a proven amount of value. So speaking of fast guys, Ben, you want to talk about Ricky Pearsall, the Florida product?
Yeah, I think he's always been somewhat of like an intriguing person to me, because I used to, as Tage knows, dabble in like the college football DFS, especially in some time at PFF, and he was the guy that always popped up from like an explosive rate in which he could potentially blow up from like a receiving standpoint that was heavily influenced by like targets and like other various metrics, I would say. And so I was kind of intrigued to see. I didn't have like a strong take on where he was going to end up from like a like an EDP standpoint or where he's kind of going to trend post combine. But I was actually in a lot of ways really impressed with what he put forth at the combine. I think, in a lot of ways wasn't necessarily like an elite 40-yard dash time or was an elite 40-yard dash time, but not necessarily an elite like 10-yard split off of that 40-yard dash time. And I wonder in some ways where his actual like game speed sits at if we did have those sorts of like tracking pieces in place, like how NFL teams are actually going to evaluate him, because like going back to it, really good strong vertical leap, really good broad jump as well. In some ways it'll be interesting to see where he fits in, but I think from like a production slot standpoint, if he does get a decent amount of targets or does go to an offense that doesn't have like a ton of really strong competition at the slot position, like he could be a guy that at least somewhat outperforms his draft stock from like a fantasy or dynasty fantasy football lean in my direction. So I think he kind of like popped up on my radar for that reason. Has kind of been around previously, so it was kind of interesting to see it come full circle and him to actually kind of be in a lot of ways a pretty strong takeaway and having a really strong combine overall here.
Yeah, Ben, and I'm glad you brought up that game speed versus 40 speed or testing speed difference, because I think that kind of became an inflection point this year at the combine with Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman's a guy who didn't put up a great 40. Actually, he would have been in the red as graded by relative athletic score with his 4.61 40. But when he's looking at the gauntlet drill, he's rolling, he's going 20 miles per hour plus. He was the highest in that drill in terms of pure speed as he's, making those game motions, catching balls and so forth and so on. Obviously not exactly something we'd see in a game, but a pretty good proxy. And so it brought about an interesting discussion about, whether or not the 40 is going to be as predictive as him, running full speed on a direct line, catching a crosser or something like that. And I almost wonder if some NFL insiders or people in front offices aren't happy that he didn't put up a great 40-yard dash, because pretty much everything else was elite across the board. He's a big guy. He's explosive. He's known as a red zone threat. When you're with such a kind of what people are looking at as a loaded wide receiver class this year, I almost wonder if him maybe tailing off or not checking that box as compared to other guys may lead him to fall into the second round or the late first. And a team may get him at a discount, and he may be an immediate contributor due to that difference between his game speed and his testing speed. So that was something that was really interesting to me. And speaking of game speed, testing speed, Tage, you brought up last week, looking at quarterbacks, that J.J. McCarthy had great speed when you watched him at Michigan, and it turned out that he did pretty well in the shuttle. What were your thoughts on McCarthy?
Yeah, so McCarthy was another one where, we thought that he could put together a pretty good combine performance, and, especially relative to the presumed top three quarterbacks in the draft not participating in the combine. Like McCarthy, I think, was the quarterback that a lot of people had their eyes on. And, he came in and ran a decent shuttle at 4.23 and then a really fast 3-cone at 6.82. And, I would have liked to see him do the broad jump or vertical, which he didn't end up doing. We know that broad jump is pretty important for quarterbacks, college to pro in general. But, as we see these situations where first round picks might, be less likely to do certain events, like they'll focus on the events that they know that they'll do well at. That's where some type of imputation or interpretation with filling out their combine metrics with game speed, like you brought up earlier, Ben, with tracking data and using that type of stuff to get like a real prediction for how well they're going to do in these events, or kind of just like filling it in based on their height, weight, and participation in the other events. Like that's going to be very important going forward.
For sure. And sticking with quarterbacks, another quarterback that we really wanted to keep our eye on, almost as an entire Class Play Contributors podcast, the Rat Pack, Spencer Rattler. Ben, talk us through Spencer Rattler, what you like and what he did at the combine.
Yeah, I would say this is more just obviously I think 4 quarterbacks did any sort of testing at the combine, Rattler being one, and in some ways the news was negative. I think in some ways like the expectation that he was going to run a fast 40 time is not necessarily reflective of what we saw, in either his time at South Carolina or Oklahoma. The thing I want to point out, and the key I think going back to it, is that 10-yard split, right? I think it's like in some ways not sitting at but borderline elite speed. So I think in the first 10 yards at least, I think what Spencer Rattler tested on is going to be completely fine. But I just want to quiet the haters at this point. I don't think this is a reason to bury Spencer Rattler, and maybe this is just me like having to deal with the algorithm because I see every single Rattler comment and those sorts of things, and I want to dispel any of that misinformation. But I think like it doesn't really change anything for me, his combine performance. And I think overall, what we see at the pro day, especially some of the throws, are really going to be the reason why Rattler ends up, as like this, second round type draft prospect or not. So to me, it doesn't really change anything. And I'm very much, I would say, kind of moving on to pro days on a lot of these evaluations.
Oh, for sure. And I think Spencer Rattler is going to be a guy who is for sure a topic of interest as we get closer and closer to April. And so, Tej, I'll let you do like a 5-second preview of why you think Spencer Rattler might be one of the top quarterbacks in this draft.
QB5 in this class, in my opinion. Arm talent, former 5-star recruit, has played in multiple systems under Lincoln Riley, some Beamer ball last year, and like really overcame a bad offensive line, like really bad offensive line, and only one real receiver on South Carolina, and still was pretty productive. So that's why I'm so excited about Rattler in this draft.
For sure. And I'm excited to see where the discussion goes. And who knows, a good pro day and maybe we see him jump all the way up with some of those top tier quarterbacks. Another guy I want to give a shout out to, Michael Pratt, Tulane, an elite vertical, an elite shuttle. This is a guy who scouts were already on as someone who could come out of the G5. Obviously, a friend of mine, having played at Tulane. Just wanted to give him a shout out as having a great day, and I'm excited to see where he goes in the draft in April. Moving on to the guys that protect the quarterbacks, let's talk about the O-line. We called out Jackson Powers Johnson. He had a bunch of good drills. Did not do a 40, didn't do any agility testing. Had a great vertical, pretty good broad jump. I think we can check that off as a pretty good prediction. Tej, you also brought up Amarius Mims as someone who could have, a big effect. The combine could have a big effect on his draft stock and maybe move him up as more of a lock at that top of the first round. What were your thoughts on Mims?
I thought Mims had a great combine overall, came in very high end height and weight, which is, I think is exactly what you saw when you watched him. And then the 40-yard dash is important for offensive tackles. He had an 88th percentile 40-yard dash. And, our friend Sam Schwartzstein did a really good video about this on the Amazon Prime Vision Twitter channel, where he was talking about the 40-yard dash in itself isn't actually like important for offensive linemen in terms of what they're going to do in a game, because they're very rarely ever going to run 40 yards straight, but it's a sign of their health and how well they're able to take care of themselves and how well that they've conditioned and trained and been in a situation. We know Georgia players are usually at that high end of that. And for him to run a 5.07 at 340 pounds, I thought just check that box and said, all right, like this guy is the type of athlete that you want. And then the most impressive thing about Amarius Mims, I think, was there was a misinformation or a mistake, I guess, in how the NFL was recording shuttle times, and they logged him at 4.33 second short shuttle, which would have been like insane for someone at his size. And people just believed it and went along with it. There wasn't much questioning about whether or not he actually got that shuttle time. And I think that just shows like how good of an athlete he is if he's able to get people to believe he ran that fast of a short shuttle, even though the data point didn't end up being true. Like it's a testament to what he's going to be able to do at the next level.
For sure. And I think when you look at the top of this tackle class, the size and speed is something that's special and separates this class from other classes. And I think another guy that we saw that from, the Notre Dame prospect. Ben, tell us about Joe Alt.
Yeah, I mean, I can obviously say, having a prediction on Joel to perform well at the combine is maybe one of like the biggest locks we could have expected. But in a lot of ways, like he proved everyone that assumed that he's like kind of this prototypical offensive tackle, presumed, I would say in a lot of ways, top 5, top 10 picks since, maybe last year at this time. And I think for all intents and purposes lived up to the hype at the combine. Obviously it's showing out that this is like a really strong offensive tackle class in general, but I do think, there was enough there from Joel to say that he is, and should maybe be, the consensus top offensive tackle. Now, I think there was maybe still a little bit of question before the combine, but to me, I very much think he's like locked and loaded in that position. 3-cone, especially, absolutely elite. I do think kind of going back to, a topic that Tage and I have talked about some, like the depth in which an offensive tackle or offensive lineman can get to from a pass blocking standpoint matters so much from, a tracking data perspective. And it does seem like Joel at least has those underlying characteristics to really excel at that. And our Sloan paper kind of found that was like a really strong indication of kind of how these guys are going to perform. And I very much think that Joel is going to be, one of, if not the next best great, NFL left side tackles for a long time.
And yeah, I love Mike Renner's, comparison about like how Joel is the offensive line version of Marvin Harrison Jr. in this draft, where it's like tested really well, great film, like top of the class at their position. And then like the family ties. And like, he even went further on this point where it's like, when you play a position that there's so much technique involved, like offensive tackle or wide receiver, like having, a family member that played in the NFL and can kind of teach you some of that technique from a younger age, like is really important. So it's a really cool comparison to think about, all as the offensive line version of Harrison, or Harrison as the offensive or the wide receiver version of Alt.
Yeah, I really like that. That's good.
For sure. Joel, as a Notre Dame product, I got to give it to him. But that size and that speed, it's something that you can't really teach. And that's a football cliche. But moving on to the next prospect that we're very interested in, Alt and Mims, big Power 5 teams, a lot of production in college, were already looked at as great pieces to teams in top of the first round. But looking at Isaac Guarando, Tage, he's very unheralded, but put on perhaps one of the best in history, a 9.99 RAS score, jumping probably from a position where he wasn't going to be drafted into a place where, he's probably solidly going to be drafted. Some of his RAS comps, as given by RAS.football, if you want to go check that out, Edgerrin James, Saquon Barkley, Amon Green, Joseph Dye, these are guys that are really great. And as you highlighted, he broke that 220 marker of what you want to see from a very productive running back at the combine. And so what were your thoughts on Isaac Guarando and how he's going to progress?
Yeah, Guarando is so interesting to me because he came into combine weekend 320th on the consensus big board. So, you talk about someone who's probably not going to get drafted coming in. He was the backup running back at Louisville. Jawar Jordan had a good year last year, 6.2 yards per carry. And then Guarando had 6.1 yards per carry while being the running back too. So pretty similar efficiency to someone who was a high-end college football running back, but, just didn't get much volume. And I think, people were probably lower on him because of that. But yeah, like you said, like when you come out and you have one of the best NFL combines in running back history, you have, where you run a 99th percentile 40-yard dash, 4.33 seconds at 221 pounds, which is, breaking that 220-pound threshold that usually means you can be a pretty good running back. Like that is going to boost you up draft boards a lot. And, whether or not it should is up for debate. The 40-yard dash isn't necessarily super predictive of NFL success, but weight adjusted 40-yard dashes is more predictive. And that's where he really excelled is having one of the best weight adjusted 40-yard dashes of all time.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in on the film on Guarando because obviously coming from Louisville, you mentioned kind of a 2-back system. He was a backup for most of his career. I'm really excited to kind of see, does he have that shiftiness that smaller players may have, but we know at this point that he has the strength, that he has the explosiveness to be an NFL player. Now it's just up to him to put it all together. And I'm interested to see if teams, with a lot of consistency at coaching, don't, jump up and take a risk on him maybe in the 4th or 5th round, just knowing that, they potentially have someone who could be a next level player in that kind of next level with that next level physicality. So Ben, you wanted to take a closer look at the Oregon product, Bucky Irving. Tell us a little bit more about Irving.
Yeah, this was more, I didn't want to just say off camera, all these strong predictions hit. I also wanted to maybe bring up one that was maybe a little bit more of a miss, but I was talking with our pal and coworker, Quinn Macklin, who is like a heavy Oregon Ducks fan basically. And we were talking about some of his favorite prospects like a couple weeks ago. And he did bring up Bucky Irving. And I was very much like kind of on board with the read that he could actually be somewhat productive at the NFL level. So I think going back to it, looking at kind of how he did from like a combine perspective, obviously, the RAS score 3.72 looks dramatically, to the downside. Obviously, a lot of that is influenced by his 4.55 40-yard dash and the fact that he, only is 5'9" and 192 pounds. I think at a few weeks ago when Quinn and I were talking, we had discussed this idea of like the next iteration of the Garrett Blount, 50 pounds lighter. And in a lot of ways, he measured at that weight, but probably doesn't bring the same skill set in a lot of ways as Blount. And I think that was maybe a miss. But looking at the underlying metrics, I think there may be still some reason for optimism. And I think kind of going back to the article that we published on Sumer, there is a case to be made for guys who aren't necessarily the ones who create all the headlines post combine, right? And there are going to be some spots where teams can find value if they unearth some things. And I'm not saying Bucky Irving is necessarily that guy in a nutshell, but I think his 10-yard split 1.54 measured like a 9.01 from an RAS perspective, didn't do the shuttle or the 3-cone. If his agility and quickness is at least somewhat present at the Oregon Pro Day, I do think he is a guy that could still be somewhat productive at the NFL level. And if he does go a little bit underdrafted because of the combine status, could be a relatively, cheap option from a dynasty standpoint if you are kind of into that, rookie running back window sort of thing for your fantasy team. So although he didn't test really well, and although he won't be making the dynasty headlines, I very much think that, given time and some pro day and the right fit, he could still be a somewhat productive NFL football back, I would say.
Yeah. So moving from an off-camera prediction to someone that we are very much on the record about in totality as a class, we all three loved this interior D line class. I mean, you look at some of the names. We love Johnny Newton, the Illinois product. He didn't really test, but we still expect him to be a high draft pick. Someone like Tavondre Sweat, RAS score of 3.9, not ideal, but when you look at him as a 366-pound product at the nose guard, some of that 5.27 speed really kind of changes the view on how he performed and what he can be at the next level. Chris Jenkins, the Michigan product, great combine, great 40-yard dash, great broad jump. Mason Smith out of LSU, 8.99 RAS score. Braden Fisk lit it up, 9.97 RAS score, the Florida State product with a blazing fast 40-yard dash, 4.7. And so, Ben, I'll give you the opportunity. You got asked about this last week, about whether Byron Murphy was going to be the next great purple people eater, Vikings defensive lineman. What were your thoughts on Byron Murphy?
Yeah, I thought it was, overall impressive. Obviously, really sound 40-yard dash time. I think in some ways, obviously, the concern has to be, the height and weight situation coming in under 300 pounds at the interior defensive line position. He is going to be somewhat needing to be in a rotation, at least starting off. And I think that has to be a little bit of a concern. So though I think, some of the raw stats were good, didn't test in the agility, framework. I think overall encouraging, but I think the jury's still out on, what Kwesi is going to value and how this, I would say entire offseason even shakes out for our Minnesota Vikings, unfortunately, because I would say the news out of, Minnesota Vikings with Mike Florio kind of circling the wagon and Kirk Cousins, family moving out of town means that they might need to do a little bit more of a rebuilding at key positions and premium spots as opposed to going Byron Murphy as a depth piece in the second round for us. So I think I got to change my prediction, at least for where he ends up.
Good points. Tej, you brought up a lot of these interior defensive linemen. I'll give you the floor to kind of hit the ones that really caught your eye, and maybe give us a deeper view into where you may think they go on draft day.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say is Ben was actually, he beat Florio to the punch on the Kirk Cousins news. Told me, like, I don't know, it was probably 2 months ago that Kirk Cousins was considering moving his family to Minnesota. So, just keeping that in the group, which is very nice of him to do, while other people are speculating out there. But yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to this defensive line class, like, you guys hit on the main ones. Like, I think both Braden Fisk and Byron Murphy were the big winners of the combine, just because that speed was so evident there. And it's just kind of a sign of, like, all right, like, maybe for, some of these defensive linemen, like, are we getting smaller at that position? Like, both of them were under average at weight, like at 292 and 297 respectively. So that'll be something that's really interesting to watch going forward, is that. But for me, it was Chop Robinson that really stood out to me from an edge perspective. I think that when you look for him, and when you look at him play in actual games, his get off speed is one of the best that we've seen in college football. And I think that should translate pretty nicely to the NFL. And that showed up in his 10-yard split. He had a 1.45 second 10-yard split, which was 99th percentile. And, that's exactly what he showed in college. He was so quick getting off the line in Penn State's game against Michigan that Michigan ran the ball the entire second half, because they were so scared of what he was going to do to them in the pass game. And I think that's just really like a testament and an omen to what he can do from a pass rushing perspective. And, his short arms, 32.5-inch arm length, is a little worrisome, but I think he can make up for that with some of his speed off the line.
Yeah, looking at another speedy edge rusher and someone that I think is a good signal for where college football may be going in the NIL era. There's a lot of talk about how the talent will get pilfered up, but it's encouraging to see someone come out of the Southland Conference. Houston Christian, Jalix Hunt, 4.64 40. They tell you that speed kills, and the NFL will find the talent where it is. I think Jalix Hunt proved on this weekend that that's still true. He had a 9.73 RAS score, very athletic, and I think when you're an FCS guy or a lower G5 guy, some of these metrics really matter because in theory you haven't been going up against great talent. So I'm excited to see where he ends up on draft day after that. So moving from kind of the D linemans to the defensive backs, Another guy that I thought did a great job was Quinyon Mitchell, another G5 product out of Toledo, put on a show with the 4.33 40. I think a lot of that speed and kind of mirroring ability, he's also been talked about as a guy who played wide receiver for most of his career. And he claims that he knows kind of how pass routes work and how to read the defense. And I think when you couple that as a G5 prospect with a great combine day, I think it really vaults him up into that cornerback 1 spot. And I'm interested to see where he ends up going on draft day. Tej, did anyone else interest you from that defensive backfield core group?
Well, I'm just worried that all these defensive backs are going to do so well, where the Lions aren't going to be able to take any of them at pick 29 here. But Mikey, I think he actually goes by Mikey, like, said like Nike. Mikey Sandstrill from Michigan, I thought also did a good job. I think that he's been getting a lot of Mike Hilton comps to, filling that spot for the Bengals, which, like, I love. And I know our friend Arjun Menon is all over that as well.
Definitely. Ben, what about you? Anyone stand out from the DBs?
Yeah, this is a guy that I kind of had my eye on. Basically, I do like the SEC ties. Nehemiah Pritchard, basically Auburn, obviously played an entire season in 2022. I think in a lot of ways, maybe I would have expected him to be a little bit bigger, 190 pounds, not necessarily reflective of the way in which he played. But I do think he ran, I would say, relatively elite 40-yard dash time. I would have really liked to see his agility testing, so I do hope that he does do the Auburn Pro Day, because obviously his vertical jump was underwhelming and didn't participate in the broad jump. So I'm curious a little bit more about his actual explosion and ability to accelerate. But I think if he can kind of, I would say, check those boxes and at least do somewhat well from a Pro Day standpoint, I think he could be a relatively intriguing later round prospect given his 6'1", height and weight. And I do think he has a pretty decent size ability to be successful both from a running and coverage standpoint. So I liked Nehemiah Pritchard a little bit. I do think a little bit of his 40-yard dash time could hopefully sprinkle in to actually see a much better and sound like acceleration standpoint at his pro day. And I think if that happens, 4th round pick, 3rd round pick is very much in the cards, I would say.
For sure. Great insights, guys. And for those checking the score at home, I think we hit on pretty substantially more predictions than we missed on. So keep following us and keep following along with our predictions. We're going to check back in after the pro days. But as we always do at the class play, we're building a team, adding up to the draft of our favorite draftees, guys in past classes. So last week we did running backs. I picked Reggie Bush. Tage picked Christian McCaffrey and D'Anthony Thomas. Ben picked Michael Bennett, the workout warrior. I'm never going to forget Michael Bennett, the workout warrior now. So let's pick some D linemen this week since we focused in pretty heavily on a number of D linemen this week. Tage, tell us about your favorite D lineman pick from the past.
I think I cheated a little bit last week, taking 2 running backs. Maybe not the greatest from positional value standpoint. So we'll just take 1 defensive lineman here, and I have to go with Ndamukong Suh. Ended up from Nebraska, ended up getting drafted by the Lions, which made it even sweeter. But I just loved him before the draft because you think about that conference championship game where he had 4 sacks on Colt McCoy, controversial ending, but like really took over that game. And Spencer Hall, like every day should be Saturday, put together a great rundown his final year at Nebraska, where he had as many tackles for loss and sacks as about the Texas defensive line, the Florida defensive line, and the Alabama defensive line. So if you compared just his stats individually, he would stack up pretty well against entire defensive lines that ended up having good seasons. And, I thought that he had that fire to him. And, it was really cool to see him at the Heisman ceremony and like see his story from being a soccer player growing up and switching to, playing football and becoming really good at it. So he was definitely my favorite defensive line prospect ever.
Yeah, and Ndamukong Suh was just an absolute beast. I remember that great game where he was getting after Colt McCoy in the Big 12 championship. It was a real rare, defensive star versus quarterback matchup where it was almost like they were playing tennis. It was one-on-one who could end up winning the game. And it came down to a controversial ending, which looking back at Ndamukong Suh's career, no better way of ending it. Ben, who's your favorite D lineman picked from the past?
Yeah, so I don't know if he's necessarily my favorite, but this is probably another deep cut similar to my Michael Bennett. So I guess I have a type basically, but I'm going to go with the gravedigger, Gilbert Brown. There's a lot of reasons for this. 2 of them, obviously we have some things in common. First, last name. Second, we also share a birthday. Third, we're also 300 pounds each. No, I'm just kidding. But we're like, that was a really bad joke. But he was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings, showed up to Vikings camp, I think after weighing, 310, 315 and ballooned up to 355. And I think he was a early 3rd round draft pick and didn't make the squad out of training camp basically. And they cut him and the Green Bay Packers immediately signed him. I think he worked off weight for a year or 2 and then became a huge fan favorite in Green Bay, basically. So the fallout from him being a Minnesota Vikings draft pick to actually being a successful starting defensive lineman for the Green Bay Packers and then turned it into a fan favorite. I think he had a Burger King burger named after him and stuff, and had a signature dance move after I think his sack celebration. So he was a guy. I think he also wore a visor and was obviously just 340 pounds, the anchor of the Packers defense. And growing up, I obviously didn't like the Packers, but I think there was always like one or two guys that have a soft spot in your heart for your arch rivals, and he was very much that guy to me for a number of reasons. So I'm happy to spend my second round pick on Gilbert Brown, more so for what he provided to me than what he provided to the Packers and the Vikings in his like 10-year career.
Yeah, definitely. And you got to love those kind of big nose guard guys. I picked one of those guys as well. Al Woods, the Elton, Louisiana product. He is a stud at LSU. I think he was like a 3 or 4 year starter, a late round draft pick to the Saints. And at the time, the Saints were not really known for picking LSU players or Louisiana players at all. Typically, they stayed away from them. Obviously, that's changed a little bit with, Tyrann Mathieu being on the team now, several other LSU products. But at the time, it was like a shock that they had picked an LSU player. And of course, I don't think he made the team, but yet he's still in the league. He's one of the oldest players in the league, extremely productive, an old school nose guard, great hands, fill up 1 to 2 gaps. I know there's a lot of Seahawks fans in the media. I was a great Seahawk for many years. And so Al Woods is one of my favorite, and another Louisiana product. Of course, I got to stick with my Louisiana bias as long as we're picking personal favorites. Barkevious Mingo, another Seahawk, unfortunately did not have the longevity that Al Woods had, but a guy who was just kind of like a new wave edge rusher at the time. Pretty thin. I think he came in at like a 230, 240. Speed rusher coming off the edge. I think he ended up playing almost like the KJ Wright position later in his career. But just kind of a different new wave kind of prospect that we didn't see at that time. Went extremely high because he tested very well. Unfortunately, didn't have the longevity, but I really loved watching him play. And it's interesting how we've kind of moved into a place where a player like a Michael Parsons, who was kind of a tweener linebacker, lighter than the typical defensive end, can just completely wreck games. And we're looking at players that are blazing it in the 40-yard dash now that are defensive ends. And so, as a former linebacker and in high school an edge defender, love to see those kind of guys play. So that's going to do it for us on the Class Play podcast. If you're watching live, definitely hit that follow button, that subscribe button on YouTube. And if you're listening to us on podcast, please subscribe and feel free to hit any of us on Twitter with any of your thoughts or comments about the podcast. We'll see you next week.